up just for a minute. Then we're all going to be sitting down. Welcome to this Starting the Conversation, Ethical Trade in Indigenous Art. It's lovely to see you all here. It is not hailing on the roof, which is an excellent thing. We were a bit worried about that earlier. I'm going to introduce the panel shortly, but as usual there's a bit of housekeeping to go through first. First thing is, if there is a fire, and you never know, see those doors that have got running men over the top of them? Go through them. Good. The toilets are out through that entranceway through which you arrived here, and on the left and the right. And, very important, could you please make sure your phones are on silent? By all means, tweet away, but silently. So just everybody check, put your phone on silent. And when we've done all of that, everyone's rumbled around in their bags and put their phones on silent. I will begin the formal proceedings of this evening. The first person we're going to hear from is Deb Lennis, the Aboriginal Programs Officer at Leichhardt Council, and she is going to do the Welcome to Country. Please welcome Deb.
Thank you, Jane. That's all right. It'd help if I actually got my notes in the right way, wouldn't it? I'm having one of those nights tonight. Birrawagul Naninya Birrawagul. Gadigal and Wongo, Yara Nagura, Dai Nangurang, Gurugal. Yanguna, Nangun, Barawa, Barongni, Dina Yaga, Ninara, Inaba, Nagura Warren, Nawa, Nagna Bai, Nagun Mari, Nararang Naya, Yanguna, Galanabana, Barana Wara, Birrawagul Nandinya Birrawagul. Welcome, everyone, welcome. Gadigal and Wongal peoples lived here at this place. Today, I welcome all of you. Look at my country, the country of my ancestors, past, present and future. We lend this land to you tonight to hold our discussion, a discussion about ethical trade in Indigenous art. Tonight is a chance to share, to educate, to learn, to understand and to break down barriers, and mostly to move forward with trust, understanding and tolerance. I would especially like to welcome the Mayor of Leichhardt Council, Rochelle Porteous, councillors from 6 possible councils, the Deputy Lord Mayor from the City of Sydney, Robin Chemist, Richard England, the Chair of the Indigenous Art Code, Tim Arca, Remote Arts Economy Project, Lynn Allen, the Ministry of Arts, Robin Ayres, Arts Australian Law, and Jackie Cornforth, Artist in the Black. And to all my Aboriginals, brothers and sisters out there, I would like to thank Leichhardt Council, Indigenous Art Code, Arts Law Australia and BizCopy for allowing me this privilege to welcome you all here tonight. Enjoy the discussion and remember, this is just starting the conversation. Birrawagul, Naninya, Birrawagul. Welcome, everyone. Welcome.
Thank you, Deb. Now we're going to hear from the Leichhardt Mayor, Councillor Rochelle Porteous, because of course Leichhardt Council are co-hosting this event tonight. Please welcome Rochelle Porteous.
Thank you, Jane. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and to say this land was and always will be Aboriginal land. And our special guests here this evening. I think Deborah gave a very good outline of everybody, but welcome again to all our special guests and councillors and deputy mayors. Tonight's event has been developed in response to the growing unease about unethical business practices that affect both Indigenous artists and buyers of their work. And I want to thank the local galleries in the Leichhardt municipality, particularly Bumali and Tali, who were the first to bring to Council's attention, and my attention as well, concerns about recent unethical trade within the industry. Their initiative led Leichhardt Council to realise the threat to our community's reputations and on a more positive note, the role that we could play in opening up the discussion on ethical trade in Indigenous art at a local government level. So just to give you a bit of a background, Leichhardt Council is a fair trade council. Fair trade is about purchasing goods where there is a certification that enables us to know that the workers are being fairly compensated for their work with decent pay and good working conditions. Furthermore, as a fair trade council, we not only look at what we purchase ourselves to, wherever possible, purchase fair trade, but we also take on an advocacy role within our community. So we promote businesses where there are fair trade practices, and we raise awareness of fair trade. And that fair trade benefits communities both locally and globally. Leichhardt Council also has a long history and association with the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities within the Leichhardt LGA. We have our own LATSIC committee, which meets regularly, and we're committed to the principles of cooperation and reconciliation, always ensuring the process is done with respect, trust, and a spirit of openness. So tonight's public forum is hosted by Leichhardt Council in conjunction with the Indigenous Art Code and the Eastern Region Local Government Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Forum. And in partnership, the Eastern Region Local Government Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Forum is actually a partnership between 6 councils, and those councils are Leichhardt, City of Sydney, City of Botany Bay, Randwick, Waverley and Wallara. These 6 local governments recognise the importance of supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and have contributed to tonight's event to show that ethical art is an important issue across not just our community but all communities. And by working with the Eastern Region Local Government Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Forum, we are acknowledging this issue is in fact not confined to Leichhardt. The Indigenous Art Code works across Australia and internationally to educate and inform consumers on purchasing Indigenous art ethically and to provide a structure for dealers to promote ethical practice. Local governments have worked on this event with the Indigenous Art Code to respect the significant contribution Indigenous artists make to the to the Australian visual art sector, the economy and society as a whole. Tonight's hosts, Leichhardt Council, the Eastern Region Local Government, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Forum and the Indigenous Code, appreciate and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and have joined together to assist in this discussion of ethical trade. Leichhardt Council believes that local government can and should take a positive role in this discussion and help to promote ethical practice as best practice. And I'm proud to say that here in Leichhardt Council, we take supporting our community very seriously. We acknowledge that unethical trade is a long-standing issue and we hope to work collaboratively and openly to combat this issue and create a safe, ethical space for our Indigenous artists to create and to succeed. I'd like to acknowledge our supporters, the Australian Government Indigenous Visual Arts Industry Support, the Art Law Centre of Australia, Viscopi and NITI One, the Cooperative Research Centre for Remote Economic Participation. I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of many individuals in developing and participating in this event. Gabrielle Sullivan from the Indigenous Art Code, producer Rose Hesp, our presenter Jane Carrower, and our 6 panellists tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge and warmly thank council staff, particularly Erla Rowan, Tara Day-Williams, Rebecca Raymond, Bronwyn Tui, and of course our wonderful Deb Lennis. This is the first forum we have and we hope that this will grow, that there will be further forums. We want to be part of this, we want to make this grow and we want to see other forums happening in other parts of Sydney. So I'd like to welcome you to the first of the Starting the Conversation events and to wish you a very good evening and I look forward to joining you afterwards for some refreshments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Porteous. Our next speaker is Richard England, who is the Chair of the Indigenous Art Code and so is co-hosting the event with the Mayor of Leichhardt.
Thank you. Leichhardt Mayor, Councillor Rochelle Porteous, ladies and gentlemen, Councillor Porteous has done a wonderful job of acknowledging all the people in the room, so I don't want to stop anybody from hearing the rest of the show, so just accept that you're all acknowledged. I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal and Wangal peoples, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. The point you made, I think, was a wonderful point, that this land is Aboriginal land, was and always will be. And I think as long as we all recognise that, none of us has any particular ownership or entitlement. I think it's a wonderful thing. Thank you. The Indigenous Art Code is extremely excited by tonight's event as we start a conversation about ethical trade in Indigenous art. The Art Code seeks to ensure that there is a viable and vibrant Indigenous art industry through promoting best practice and ethical dealing aimed at ensuring artists get a fair go and the consumer is sufficiently educated to know that they're getting what they pay for. Focusing on consumer education is the next vital step for the Indigenous Art Code. We're delighted by the new relationship that we have with local government, and we look forward to developing and strengthening that relationship and encouraging more local government authorities to become involved. They are, after all, representatives of the grassroots of society. There's so much to celebrate about Indigenous art sector of the broader art industry. But it's the bad behaviour of a few that has, in effect, undermined the confidence of consumers, where they have every right to expect ethical conduct, honest trade and best practice for their purchasing decisions. We're all looking forward to this evening's conversation, and I particularly want to thank the panel members, some of whom have travelled a considerable distance to be here and given up their time to be with us tonight and lead us in what promises to be a fascinating insight into dealing in Indigenous art. So, thank you. Without further ado, on with the show.
Thank you, Richard. It's now my pleasant duty to introduce the 6 people who are going to take this interesting subject and wrestle it into shape. No pressure, guys. Immediately to my left is Christopher Hodges. Christopher is the director of Utopia Art Sydney, which represents a small group of Australian artists, including leading members of Papunya Tula artists. Welcome, Christopher. Next to Christopher is Francesca Carbillo. Francesca is a Larrakia, Bardi, Wardaman and Yanyuwa woman from the Northern Territory. She's also Senior Curator, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art, National Gallery of Australia and Chair of the Darwin Aboriginal Art Fair. Please welcome Francesca. Next to Francesca is Christian Barry. Christian is head of the School of Philosophy at the Australian National University and is currently working on a major Australian Research Council project. It's entitled The Ethical Responsibilities of Consumers. Please welcome Christian. On my right is Lizzie Markeely Ellis. Lizzie is a Nananajara educator, interpreter and linguist from Western Australia. She tried to teach me how to say that word, I just failed spectacularly. Lizzie is also an arts worker for Jalili Art, when she's home in Chukula in the Western Desert, where she paints when she has the time. Welcome, Lizzie. Beside Lizzie is Adrian Newstead. Adrian is an art consultant with 40 years' experience working with Indigenous artists and author of the intriguing but bluntly titled The Dealer is the Devil, an insider's history of the Aboriginal art trade. Please welcome Adrian. Beside Adrian is Jeff Hassel. Jeff is an art collector of 40 plus years who's been collecting Indigenous art since 1996. Jeff received an OAM last year for services to the arts. Please welcome all our panellists. Now, before we get to the pointy end of the evening, I'm just going to let you know how this panel discussion is going to run. Basically, I'm going to ask the panel an establishing question in a moment. Then I've got a series of scenarios which I'm going to read out to us all and get the panel to discuss. Now, there will also be some pre-submitted questions from the floor. We're not actually taking random questions from the floor, just simply because with 6 panellists, 4 scenarios and such a big topic, there won't be time for that. But there are some questions coming from the floor at the end of each of the scenario discussions, because it's my job to keep us to time. So, what's our first question? Our first question is really the obvious one, and that is I'm asking each of the panellists to explain the importance of Indigenous arts to Australians, its worth to our culture, its place both locally and internationally. And I'm going to start, because he's sitting right next to me, with Christopher. What's your answer?
Well, a country is defined by its culture, and the Australia of 1970 is a very different place to the one we live in now. When I was a boy, to go to see Aboriginal art, you had to attend the Australian Museum. It was the only place that you could see it, and I was quite a regular visitor. And when I was an artist, it was still mostly at the museum that you saw Aboriginal art. When I became a representative of artists in 1987, I approached the Art Gallery of New South Wales to see what they looked towards the future of representing contemporary Aboriginal art. And they said probably about 10 major works will suffice over the next decade to enhance our collection. Well, today we sit the Art Gallery of New South Wales. You walk in the front door and Indigenous art is part of the mainstream. Indigenous art holds pride of place at all of our major galleries around Australia. The international art community has learnt more about Australian art through the position of Indigenous art than any other form, I would argue. And so I would say that Australia is a richer place for the inclusion of Indigenous culture in the broader Australian cultural landscape, and that's come about because of its artists.
Thank you. Lizzie, what's your take on the importance of Indigenous art?
I'm just going to explain from the point of view of as a person who speaks English as a second language. The word art, that one word that labels everything that you label as art, isn't, we don't have an equivalent of the word art. Instead, we've got the closest one is walka, and that's part of a word that was sacred for men only, but now it's being used more because of the art movement. And walka is, it means symbols, designs, and what's the other one? Symbols, designs, and icons. That's what it means. So all of those symbols, icons, or designs have meaning, and those meanings come from the culture, and those designs and icons and symbols were drawn on the body, on the ground, on rock, on important places, on bark, on wooden implements, spears, boomerangs, and now, because with the coming of Europeans to our land, those symbols that have been part of the culture of for Aboriginal people, that's most of it's been in the sacred realm and part of the ceremonial stuff, but a lot of that's been revealed through the art movement, and the art, it does not stand alone. It sits with the land, with the stories, with the song and dances. It's not a standalone. So from where I come from, it's part of a whole, and that's the way that it's proper to keep it in the whole form, and not to dissect it and just look at art on a canvas or on a t-shirt or on a cup or a cap or tea towel, just to please the eye. It has more meaning. Has spiritual meanings, and it's still those symbols and stories. They have owners. There are people who own those stories and own those symbols and designs, and not everybody has the authority to paint those stories and to represent those designs on canvas. So that's what art is. Like the art that's spoken in the European context is different to the way we look at it. It's part of our culture. It's part of everything.
Thank you, Lizzie. Adrian, how do you see the importance of Indigenous art?
Well, really, what I would say picks up really on what Lizzie just said. To me, Aboriginal art in Australia and its importance to Australia, it's the most potent land rights statement in this country. And an Aboriginal elder said to me when I first started in Aboriginal art, put art on people's walls, and that'll do more to affect the way they think about Aboriginal people and they think about their place in this country than anything else you could do, going into land rights marches and etc. So I see it as the most vital land rights statement. Sid Nolan in 1949, 20 years before the first Papunya painting was painted, said that in his opinion the Aboriginal artist was the greatest artist in Australia, and that all artists in Australia should aspire to the same dreaming philosophy. I think what he meant by that was that they should, that they should, in creating their art, it should come from the same feeling about the spirituality, the spiritual nature of the country, and not just see it as a pretty landscape. So I think it's important to Australia because so many of our greatest artists, non-Indigenous artists, have been so profoundly affected by Aboriginal art. And I don't mean by appropriating Aboriginal art, I mean by, seeing country as a spiritual entity. And finally, I think I would say the other most important thing about Aboriginal art to Australia is the bridge that it's built between black people and white people in this country. I think that's been a vital to the reconciliation process.
Thank you, Adrian. Francesca.
I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge Deborah, your family, your ancestors, and the land in which we have this opportunity to have this conversation. Thank you very much for your welcome. Also to Rochelle and to Richard, it is an honour to see institutions and organisations like yourself engaging with such important topics for our community, so thank you. For me, I believe it is integral that this nation has an understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, our culture and our arts. And our art is a part of this land. It is a part of the original peoples of this land, the people who were formed from this country by their ancestors, the ones who live today and look after and maintain their connection. It is just as alive and dynamic today as it was in the past, and it really sets us apart collectively, both black and white Australians. It sets us apart on that world stage. Our art is about this land. It is about our ancestors. It is about the spirit of this continent. It is about title deeds to country. It is about our intimate relationships that we have, both physical and spiritual. And so Australia, the world, needs to have that understanding. And they need to have that understanding from people who live, breathe, and fight regularly for its protection and for its maintenance. And for me, Gullaroi Yunupingu in 1993 said something about what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art is about. And he said, when we paint, whether it is on our bodies as part of ceremony or ritual, or whether it is on bark or canvas for the market, we are painting as we have always done. It is a demonstration of our connection to our country and our rights and responsibilities to it. And he said that the land owns us and we own the land. And Djambawa Marawili just recently has also said, as a ceremonial leader from that region, that the land cannot speak for itself. That's why we have to paint and tell our stories so that we can speak for this land, so that we look after it and it will look after us. And so this discussion is really important. It's a discussion about identity and who we are as a nation, but how we can move forward through art and with working with Aboriginal artists and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists and people and our culture. I think we can really achieve an awful lot as a nation. And that's why it's so important, I think.
Thank you, Francesca. Jeff.
In multicultural Australia, the dominant culture is the Indigenous one. And in the artwork that's been produced in the last 30 or so years, it's actually recorded it well. And being a collector for a long time, I think the best of art in this country has been produced in the Indigenous world, with a few exceptions, of course. But the thing that I really like to see is the best of the Indigenous art travelling through the world and being included in major exhibitions. And it opens the rest of the world's education of how incredibly good the Indigenous culture was when the first contact was made here and was largely ignored. And it's only in recent times that people are starting to wake up to what we have here. And I know that in a club that I'm a member of in Sydney is now hanging Indigenous art, and people are saying, oh, it's great to see the contemporary Indigenous art rather than that stuffy art club painting. So people are really, I think it's shifted a great deal from negative 10 years ago to positive. So it's all because of the fantastic Indigenous artists that we've had producing. Some have recently passed away, unfortunately, but the younger generation seem to be coming through well.
Thank you, Jeff. Christian.
Just listening to the other panelists, it's pretty clear to me that there is no single way in which Aboriginal art is, or Indigenous art is important to Australia, that it has different meanings to different Australians, and it has importance of different kinds to different Australians. And one of the interesting things as Australians collectively is to decide how to manage all of these different significances that this development has. I mean, one question is, to what extent is it art, as Lizzie was pointed out, in the sense that it should be a tradable commodity and treated as such? And it is currently traded as a commodity. But if it is to be traded as a commodity, are there things that distinguish it from other commodities that are traded and require special kind of protection or regulation of this market as opposed to other markets? These are things that collectively Australians need to decide and think about, whatever importance it has for them individually. To some of us, and I'm not myself an Australian, my encounters with Indigenous art is obviously quite different, and I at first certainly encounter it in a very pure aesthetic way and how it affects me, which is quite different than the sort of rich connection that someone with a greater wealth of experience and understanding of the history experiences these works of art. But we live in the same place, and we have to come to some collective understanding of how we're going to treat these artifacts and engage with one another with respect to them.
Thank you. Well, I think the consensus is it's pretty important. So that's good, because we're going to spend the next hour and a bit discussing it. So that's excellent. I'm very pleased. I have to say, I respond to it mostly aesthetically as beautiful and deeply engaging and different and unlike anything else. And that's what I get enjoyment from. But enough of me. Here is our first scenario, where we will get down to some of the things I think that Christian was referring to in terms of the differing stakeholders in this whole process. A top Aboriginal artist from the Western Desert travels 400 kilometres to Alice Springs for medical appointments. Let's call her Alice. So she's Alice in Alice Springs. A private art dealer asks Alice to visit his studio. Studio, in my notes, by the way, is in inverted commas. A place set up for Aboriginal artists to paint. He supplies canvas, paints, cups of tea and food. Alice needs money for her fuel to drive, and the dealer asks her to pose for photos in front of some artworks he has that are painted in Alice's style but are not hers. These paintings will later appear in pop-up art auctions on eBay and in commercial galleries in big cities around Australia, and that photo will be used to authenticate the works as hers. There are stories where artists are asked not just to pose for a photo, but to sign works. The artworks, by the way, are painted by lesser-known artists, some, it's claimed, by backpackers. Well, that would be a very lesser-known artist, I would have thought. There's even been reports they've been painted in Bali. So, Christopher, response to that?
Nothing new. Story we've heard a million times, and one that always fills me with incredulity because there's a lot of people who are obviously suckers or greedy or stupid, one or the other. But then there are some really ordinary people that are just taken in by shysters and salesmen. I take a very different attitude to this at the moment. I suggest that everybody learns about the artists that they're going to purchase. If you're going to buy stocks and shares, you go to a reputable stockbroker, and if you're going to do lots of things, you seek advice. And so I always recommend people to go and seek advice from public institutions. Go and see what the public institution has on their walls. Go and see what the curators collect. Look at where they collect it from. Understand the quality of the artist's work. And then, if the work you're looking at does not fall into the top 10% of that artist's body of work, and you're considering yourself to be an art collector, you do not want to buy it anyway. So all those things just fall aside.
So no impulse purchases?
Well, if you like it and you want to buy it because you simply like it, that's fine. But if you think that you're buying a work of art that's legitimate, you need to actually make sure that's correct.
Do your research.
Do your research. Do your homework.
Adrian, do you agree?
Yes, I do, to a certain degree, and probably entirely, actually. But, well, there's two things that come to mind. One is that in the 80s, people used to come into my gallery and say, invariably, how much is the artist getting out of this? And by the time the 90s came around and Sotheby's was selling Aboriginal art and it had entered into the contemporary mainstream, by far more common was to have someone come in and say, is it a good investment? Can I make money out of it? So that's the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to the motivation of people buying paintings. There will always be people that think that they're doing the right thing by buying a painting as cheaply as they can get it. And you can't do anything about that. You can tell them that, you know, if you bought it on eBay or you bought it from a cheap auction house and you know, when you go into a really good gallery and you see the provenance of the work and you see that it came from a reputable source and it's properly documented, etc., and it's $8,000, there has to be a reason why a painting is $1,500, you know, when it's just accompanied by the photograph of the artist holding up the work. It may not even be the artist. But the other part to that, and I'll try to be brief, is I had a very similar. This scenario actually is quite fresh to me in the sense that I was approached not so long ago by a French collector, quite a big one, who wanted to. Who had been buying from auctions in Europe, and he was buying beautiful paintings, there's no doubt about it, but the documentation that accompanied the paintings varied enormously. Some had documents that came from art centres, some were accompanied by folios of working photographs, some had been bought through reputable galleries in Australia, and some were only accompanied by a picture of an artist holding a painting or nothing at all. And he said, well, how do I work my way through all this? And so I said, look, do you care whether it came from an art centre or not? He said, no, I don't really care about whether it came from an art centre. I care whether it's a really good painting. I said, well, generally, if it's a really good painting, you know, it was probably, you could almost guarantee that it was painted under pretty good conditions. You know, artists don't paint really well for people that exploit them. You know, they paint perfunctory, lousy paintings for them. So I said, but as a rule, never buy a painting that isn't accompanied by a minimal level of documentation. And we went through and we decided what I would, what I was prepared to authenticate using a minimal level of documentation.
Thanks, Adrian. Christian,
I just want to say,
sorry, go.
Adrian, like I disagree with you when you said that people, you know, they choose to paint a painting that's not of good quality. I think all artists strive to do the best painting that they can, if it's possibly hand.
I think
I'd have to take exception to, because, for example, I represented the late Emily Naware throughout her career, from when she was not famous until she was really famous. And she said to me, I paint those rubbish ones for those ones because they pay rubbish money, rubbish. And so some artists actually are quite calculated in their market. Some people, some artists can't, I agree, some artists can't paint anything but what their best is, but some do.
But you wouldn't, I disagree in saying that all artists
No, not all. Yeah.
do say, I'll paint rubbish painting for this mob and I'll paint good one.
Not all.
Because there are damn good painters who paint good all the time.
yes,
I agree.
I find that artists that are painting for themselves paint the best work. But if they're painting under duress or other influences outside, they're just going through the motions. And if you really study the artist's work, you can pick it straight away without even checking the back of the painting.
That duress can come from their families.
Yeah.
Well, there's that other aspect too. They are painting their ancestors, and they're painting their country, and they're painting that dreaming narrative. So they can paint it quickly, and they can paint it over a longer period. And I guess from my perspective, they are all good paintings because they're painting their ancestors and their country. But when it meets that point of the market, then if a painting is painted quickly, it will reflect that it's been painted quickly. If it's had time, so the artist is still maintaining their cultural responsibility in terms of depicting their ancestor and depicting that important sacred site.
That's why I'm saying that you can't say this one is good art and that one is not good art, because both of them, remember what I said before, it's part of a whole. Art is part of a whole. It's part of the land, the stories, the dance, the song, and they're all symbols. So you've got to be careful in saying...
But I think that's a slightly different point from what this scenario is about, which is that this is not a painting by the artist. This is a painting by other people where she's had a photograph taken with that painting. So it's not the same as Alice deciding that she'll paint some paintings for fuel or whatever it is. It's a matter of her being asked to actually fudge. She may not be aware of it or conscious of it, but to fudge who actually the artist is. Christian, I'd like...
Can I just say, though, there is a defining aspect in that Indigenous people share rights to paint that same country. So an artist who might not actually be the author of that painting can actually share the same authority to hold that painting and hold that dreaming story. So this is where the culture and the market really intersect at this really, in our very first scenario.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Christian, this is your area of expertise. Who do you think is being exploited in this scenario, and is anyone being exploited?
Well, there are a lot of different ways people understand the idea of exploitation, but generally it involves somebody taking unfair advantage of another. And in this scenario, it seems that there are a few people who are being taken unfair advantage of. We'd need to know a bit more about them to know just how unfairly they're being treated. Certainly, whatever the meaning of the artwork is for the person standing next to it, the consumer, the intended consumer, is not going to understand notions of authorship and authority over that painting in the way that they do. And the dealer, of course, is appealing to that person. And so that person is certainly being taken unfair advantage of, at least insofar as we don't think it's reasonable for them to easily be able to detect that this sort of ruse is going on. The way you describe the case, the person is, in some sense, even posing for the picture under some kind of duress. She needs fuel to go back, so she's being taken unfair advantage of. And I think a lot of these issues that they're endemic shouldn't really be surprising, in that any time a tremendous amount of resources or perspective, or the prospect of a lot of resources flood into an area which is relatively resource poor and where people are needy, it creates tremendous incentives for this kind of manipulation and dissembling with an attempt to sort of capture gain. So in this case, if she's knowingly going along with this, knowing that this is going to happen, then she also bears some measure of responsibility too, and I'm sure that that is sometimes the case. It may not be the case in this hypothetical.
No, exactly.
Sorry, can I just add that's the element that, you know, we hear about, that the market needs to be educated, you know, and know what they're buying and how they're engaging, but the artists need to also be educated and have that information so that they are making informed decisions as to what they are prepared to do and take responsibility for and what they're not.
Can I just say, who has that knowledge? The people that have that knowledge, you know, are very few. I mean, if you ask who really knows Emily's oeuvre so well, and I think I do, that they could tell you, they could look at a painting and say, that was painted in 1992, maybe late 1991.
And the month.
Right? And the month, etc. And that represents a style that is actually using elements that came from an earlier period. Kathleen Pachari is a perfect case in point. She painted wonderful paintings for her agent in Alice Springs. These established her reputation as one of the finest artists, Aboriginal artists in the country. When she went back to Alice Springs, she was at the mercy of a large and avaricious family, painted the same images quickly. Yes, they were her dreaming. They were like chalk and cheese. And then now her grandchildren are painting those ones. The same image, they're being held up by Kathleen and being sold. You could say to Kathleen, why are you doing this? You're undermining your market. Your market? She doesn't care about her market. That's the least, I mean, she's not interested in the white market. She's interested in supporting her family that need money in the here and now. And that's the reality of life for Aboriginal people who, as you said, you know, are a rare commodity. Someone that can earn a lot of money in a community that has none.
Yeah. We do need to move on to scenario 2. Fascinating though this is. Let me go to this next scenario. You are, imagine for a moment, a first-time buyer of Aboriginal art. You want to see the artwork on location, so you're doing some due diligence. You make a trip to Central Australia and go to an art centre in a community outside Alice Springs. You find some beautiful works and buy them. A year later, you're in Sydney and pop into a few harbourside art galleries where you see similar works by the same artist, but they're a lot cheaper and they're a lot neater. They don't have bits of sand and dog hairs in them. You might miss those, I would have thought. Did that person get ripped off? I mean, we're looking at authenticity issues, elite art versus market art, which we were also just talking about in the previous scenario, but also we're talking about primary, secondary and tertiary markets. So, Jeff, what do you think? Was that purchaser ripped off?
No.
Okay, why not?
Because the work that was available in a commercial gallery in Sydney that had no dust or dog hair on it would not have the proper documents on the back of the painting. Most of the art centres have codes that they write on the back of the canvases, numbering and initials, and it's all recorded and it can be checked back for decades. The paintings that were available in the commercial gallery in Sydney, probably if you asked for a letter of authenticity, you would get one from the commercial gallery with the artist's photo on it. The commercial gallery, maybe in a year's time, no longer exists. No state gallery would even accept those paintings as a donation. no valuer for the taxation incentive scheme would value them. So the person buying in Sydney would be the one ripped off, not from the art centre.
Okay. And Christopher, you were saying that people who are looking to purchase Aboriginal art should do their research, and it sounds like this first-time buyer has, and has in fact bought the right painting.
Well, there's two things to take into account.
Okay.
One of them is that art is a very special commodity, and art is valued in different ways. It's not valued on the cost of the paint and the canvas and the dots. Art is given value because of the content which is in it, the power which is in it, the aesthetic arrest that it can cause when you look at it. So there is better art and lesser art. There is production art. I'll give a white example. You don't want to buy an Arthur Boyd that was painted after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because Arthur Boyd painted seriously all morning and in the afternoon painted his quick ones for the marketplace. And you see them in auctions, they've got swans in them. You can see them all. There's hundreds of them around. And he painted them to order, read his biography, which his wife signed off on. Indigenous artists do the same thing, which is their right. However, I would suggest that anyone that wants to support Indigenous artists, or indeed support any artists, the closer you can come to buying the work from the artist, with the artist in the room, the better it is for the artist, the better it is for the artist community. So in buying a work directly from an artist's representative, where the artist still is the owner of that painting, that is the closest you can come to supporting the artist. Now, I always suggest as one of the things people can say to when they're in shops, I say, when you're in Alice Springs, simply ask the shop owner, who owns this picture now? Does the artist own it or do you own it? And in most cases, the shopkeeper will own it if it's a shop. If it's an artist representative organisation, I represent the Papunya Tula artists, and in Alice Springs they have in that work, all the artists are still involved in the sale of the artwork. It's still their work. And that's the closest you can come to actually knowing where it comes from. That piece of paper that you get with it, the certificate, you've got to make sure it goes back to a controlled database. And so the Papunya Tula documentation is a controlled database that goes back to 1971. And you can actually chase that. There are no photos of artists on that document. But there is a signature, there is a number, and it's traceable directly back to the day that it was handed in, and the artist dictated the details of that picture. So that's that's the closest you can get.
Thank you. We actually have an audience question now from Bronwyn Tui.
I'd like to ask the panel, I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories about the treatment of Aboriginal artists. I'd like to hear what you can tell us about some of your experiences in that regard.
The treatment of Aboriginal artists.
By who?
I guess dealers, studios, and I'm probably intimating in terms of negative treatment.
There's a million stories out there of how people are treated in the broader world, and I've heard, everything from the best luxury accommodation, showers, 3-course meals, to bribery, corruption, and the stories are so huge and so varied, and some of them so horrible and some of them so incredible that I can't single one out to tell you, but everything that you could possibly imagine, I've heard the story.
Lizzie?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm an artist, and I'm ashamed to say that I have been one of those artists who've been disrespected by art centre managers. And they're young people who are the same age as my children. Disrespect me and my mother in our own community. Now, art centre managers have to understand that respect is number one. You are there for your livelihood. Just because you're a manager Don't get on your high horse and bully people to say, you can't go there and paint. It is the prerogative of the artists. There are many factors as to why they do go and paint in those situations that we say is not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And as a market, as a person buying in the market, the effect that you can have is to place the artist's best work in the highest esteem, and you usually see that at the exhibitions of their work in major galleries. And the acknowledgement of the best work, the support of the artist's best work, I think always finds you a truer painting, and helps the artist.
I just want to say that my mother was the subject of this conversation with the Arts Centre manager. And that Arts Centre manager was managing in my community. And I told that Arts Centre manager where to go. Politely. He came over at 5 p.m. and apologized to me. And he was lucky that I didn't tell my mother exactly what he said. Otherwise, my mother would have gotten a fighting stick and gone over there and dealt him a lesson. And he would have been kicked out of the community by me and my mother.
Sounds like there's some fairly feisty artists out there, and it's really good to hear that.
But we're also very respectful.
Yes, absolutely.
And we look after our Arts Centre managers.
Yes.
We tell them, you're doing something wrong. Well, I do. What you're doing is wrong. Just slow down. Be respectful.
Good, as you should. I don't like it when taxi drivers call me dear. I'm just putting that out there. Adrian, as someone that used to work for one of the big auction houses, there seems to be a number of auction houses out there at the moment. Can you explain auction houses dealing with the secondary market and auction houses dealing with the primary market? What's the difference between those two?
There used to be a golden rule with auction houses that you don't deal in wet paintings. You know, wet is a term that we refer to a painting that's, you know, only recently been painted, or one that's better sold in the primary market. It's not seen to be seemly.
What do you mean by the primary market?
Well, the primary market is are the galleries that directly represent artists or art centres,
okay,
and are the first place where a painting is sold.
Gotcha.
I mean, okay, the primary markets are, in a strange way, in competition with their suppliers, because the art centres get a lot of government funding, and most of them wouldn't be viable without it. You know, they wouldn't be able to balance their books. But in order to be able to make enough money to survive, they need to sell a certain amount of work retail, like direct to the clients. Like our friend here, you know, who thinks that he's doing the artist a big favour by going out there and buying direct from the art centre. But actually what he's doing is undermining the market, because every market is an elitist construct, and art is especially an elitist construct. And, you know, the galleries are the legitimate marketing arm of the arts. I'm not talking about black art or white art, I'm talking about all art right across the board. You know, they're the ones that pay the rents in the cities, that pay for advertising, that organise the exhibitions. This is how artists become important. If everything was sold directly from the communities, that's like a car maker selling something directly off the factory floor. That is not integrated market structure, and if the artist isn't having exhibitions, solo exhibitions, group exhibitions, etc., then their career is not being enhanced in any way. You know, so it's not generally. I mean, I'm not saying there's anything particularly wrong with it, other than it's the paradigm in which we work is being subverted by art centres selling direct to the public. But they have to do it because they need the money. Anyway, that's a fact of our lives. But that's whether it sells from the art centre or whether it sells from a gallery to the end user, that's the primary market. The secondary market is when all that art, and believe me, there is an absolute tsunami of secondary market art coming back into the market.
So this is art that's already been bought by somebody?
Over the last 150 years.
Right.
And it's been traded or stayed in a family.
So somebody's selling it on?
And they, somebody that bought a painting when they were in their 40s, 50s or 60s is now in their 70s, 80s or 90s, and their children don't want it and they don't want to give it to an institution, they put it into an auction. Right. And that's the secondary market. And the secondary market, that's what auction houses really exist for. So there has been, I get the point of your question, because there's been a proliferation of a new breed of auction house that's coming in and actually setting up studios, workshops, sheds, or whatever you want to call them, in Alice Springs, getting artists to paint for them, and then selling them direct into the market through an auction. And this is the most famous, was one that was operating out of this electorate or this council area that had, was taking out full-page ads in the newspaper with the same painting duplicated twice, saying, in gallery price $7,500, and the next one had indicative auction price $1,500. Why pay gallery prices? And believe it or not, they were actually exhibiting the Indigenous Art Code logo at the bottom of their ads and saying, we treat artists fairly. Well, they were one of the first cases that the Indigenous Art Code sort of investigated, and they're still operating. They've just changed their name and moved out of the council area.
Very interesting. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
The ABC actually did an investigation into that same auction house and found that they, not with Indigenous work, but with non-Indigenous work, and found that their works being offered for sale were very, one was pulled out of the frame and was proved to be a photocopy, and the curator, the conservator who opened that and looked at it, received threatening phone calls for simply opening something and looking at it. But it brings us to a very important point that we all have to think about today, ethics. The ethics of representation are very important. I represent, when I opened my gallery, I started on the principle that I was going to represent Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists side by side and totally equally. So I didn't put stories on the wall, and I didn't even hand out certificates for the first 10 years. I used to just make people come in. I educated people a lot about the artists and their communities and introduced the artists and that, but I worked it so that the people had to come in and learn something themselves about what was going on and about the artists. And that educational process that we went on established for some artists an orderly marketplace. And in any business sector, there should be an orderly marketplace. So I had a structure where, as the gallery representing a community organisation on behalf of the artist, and I knew the artists personally we had a business structure that was normal, the same as every other artist I represented, and this marketplace functioned well. Emily Naware, I'll use as the example, was an unknown artist when I represented her first, and we managed to have great success with her work. We had no problem putting her work into the National Gallery of Australia, into the Homes of Court Collection, into private galleries across Australia. We did that well, we did it competently and did it easily. But within a short period of time, other people felt that they could do it just as well, if not better. And so they entered the marketplace. And after a little while, others thought they could too, and they entered it. Now, the first person that entered the marketplace was at least smart, and he followed exactly what I was doing, to the point when I had an exhibition in the gallery, he'd turn up to the gallery 2 weeks beforehand and offer them work by the same artist, which undermined my relationship with the gallery. And so, was his behaviour ethical? I don't know, I can't work that one out. And then But at least he knew the market, so he didn't bugger it up. He followed me, he was ruthless, but he didn't actually mess the market up. He kept the price structure, he didn't flood it, he was aiming at the same audience. But then along came these really great, intelligent people who reckon, I could find this artist, I can get her to sit there, paint some pictures, at least 3 dots on the top, take some photographs of this woman, and flog them in supermarkets and stuff, devaluing the market. And you see, then there were guys who figured that they could offer the nephew a car. And if she painted this big picture there, the nephew would get the car. She loved the nephew, adored him. Painted the picture. At the end of the picture, she stood up, grabbed the billy can, walked away. She had the shits. The nephew got the nod and he drove off in the car, and the picture is now hanging in the National Gallery of Victoria. It's a beautiful painting. Was that ethical? Then you go to the next level of people who swapped food and provisions for other paintings, and then you go to the next level of the guy that got her to sit with the get the photographs taken in front of all the other pictures, which are everywhere and are ubiquitous and, on the whole, terrible. Now, all those levels exist, and all those people that tagged on the end sought to destruct an orderly market. And the worst example of this is Kathleen Pajara's sister, Gloria Pajara, who was an amazing painter, a beautiful painter, a great innovator, the second most important painter on Utopia in the beginning. And her family started to paint pictures like her. Then a lady in Alice Springs started painting pictures like her. And the galleries in Alice Springs, in all their wisdom, they'd have a Gloria Pajara there, $1,200. They'd have a sister's painting there, $800. And they'd have 3 other people's pictures there, $600, $500, $400. And they all looked very similar. Not the same, but very similar. Her market is completely ruined. She has work in every major gallery in Australia. Beautiful work of the highest quality. But her market has been ruined by people who have no understanding of a marketplace, no respect for the artist and their work, certainly no respect for the dealers that have represented them. And as an artist representative for over 25 years, I would say the thing missing from the market is respect for the artists and respect for order and their right to have an orderly marketplace. And that's an important aspect.
The other thing too as well is that what we don't really have factored in, except in a bit of a way in terms of Adrian mentioning the primary market and how art centres are in competition with commercial galleries. I think we really do need to focus on how important the art centre is in an Indigenous community. They fulfill so many multiple roles, and providing a safe space to produce art is only one aspect of the role they play. And I think I should be able to buy a car that comes off, off the chain. I should have that option. If I want to buy it from there, or I want to go to a car dealer, or if I want to get it at, Pickles auction, I should have that option. And I think our Indigenous art centres aren't resourced enough and aren't given that wonderful kudos. I mean, they engage with respectable commercial galleries to ensure that artists are being represented in a really important way, and that the market is being developed for that, either that individual or for that community. But what we see is when art centres aren't working properly, when you have the wrong person in those jobs, or when you have the right person and they go after 12 months, the market ends up being so messy, dangerous, evil, and it's reflected in the artwork. So I think art centres are so integral, and Indigenous governance over those art centres, not outsider governance, Indigenous governance, community governance, to ensure that it operates appropriately and effectively.
Thank you, Francesca. Christian.
Yeah, well, one thing that the contrast with the car case brings out is that it's not easy to sort of immediately get into the car sales business in the same way that it seems to be easy to get into the art sales business, right? So there are certain features of the art market that make it, well, particularly difficult, I think, for consumers to have some clear sense of what reasonable precaution looks like. I mean, if you're buying vehicles, first of all, new vehicles, you just can't make them up usually, and you're certainly not going to be buying them in a dark alleyway. And you could pretty much trust that if you're buying them on Parramatta Avenue or something, right, you're going to, with big glossy signs, that's going to come with it a certain kind of acknowledgement of authenticity. And there's no obvious equivalent. I mean, there are equivalents in the sense that the art centers will mark them and you could trace it back, but certainly there's not the sort of obvious sense of what a reasonable good faith purchaser is going to expect from the market in the arts as they would with respect to something like vehicles. So the question is how you actually deal with that, right? The question is how it is that you can unburden the consumer by giving them relatively routine and easily checkable ways of identifying some of the characteristics that went into bringing this art to market. Its authenticity, the conditions under which it was produced, because it seems really important to give that information in some easily digestible, checkable form to them, because they can't count on the normal, obvious rules that take place in the markets of something like cars or things where it's much more difficult to enter. It's much more difficult to engage in this kind of, what would you call an undermining of an orderly market. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're describing too is the inevitable result of success. So this is, in a way, the reason, Aboriginal art has become a very desirable thing. So that makes it the sort of market that somewhat unscrupulous people want to involve themselves in. I'm aware that we have another audience question from Kate Massola. Kate?
We actually haven't got Kate here tonight,
we'll
but
move
we've
on.
got Janelle going to ask that same question.
Go Janelle.
Thank you. The question is, how do you see the art market picking up in light of the government's Indigenous advancement strategy and cuts to remote communities?
Who'd like to tackle that question first?
Well, I just want to say something quickly. I don't want to hog the floor, but I come from Tukula, which was on the list of the 150 communities to be closed. And if the arts centre if we were closed, the arts centre is the only little organisation in Little Tukula that makes money. So, Dalili Art, we've got a Dalili Art Centre manager sitting there, Nissa. Little Dalili Art has been in the black is good.
Black is
Black is good.
Particularly
it's been in the black for 3 years running, and we pride, we've got my aunties and mothers, they're really good painters, and they're the high end. But there's a lot of young ones like me and my sisters and other people who paint, and we are very proud of the fact that we've been managing to stay in the black and keeping Jukula running, because there's nothing else there. So that's a good thing. And also, just to say something about what you said, Christopher, quickly, about our auntie. We come from, Pupanyatula. A lot of the painting was about the Dingari cycle. And my father was the boss for Dingari ceremony. There's lots of song lines for the Dingari ceremonies, but for one of them, he was the boss. And we can't paint that because we're a woman. But men can. But because we can't paint Dingari, but we can paint other stories that are close to Dingari. And our aunties, they give us the authority and they show us. They say, paint like this, paint this country, and you copy them. And Nissa can tell you, you can pick up all the paintings that me and my sister paint, and you can tell, oh, that's one of the Giles girls, because that's Purung. So, going back to family can paint the one story, because we've got that, when I said earlier, people, families have the authority to hold knowledge, to hold the designs and stories.
So there's a difference here, isn't there, between the Western idea of the artist and the Indigenous idea of the story, which has many tellers.
Collectively owned,
Yes.
and therefore can be collectively represented.
Okay, it's very interesting.
But the people that are marketing the art, the people that are making the sales of the art, tend to not be the Indigenous people. And the shopkeepers in Alice Springs who can, I don't mind somebody saying, I'm going to, it doesn't make any economic sense for the advancement of Indigenous artists for a shopkeeper to have 4 different products on the wall looking vaguely the same with 4 different price points of it. Nobody is being advanced by that method. In fact, everyone's getting dragged down to the lowest common denominator. And I have a relationship with the Papunya Tula artists that began in 1988. There's been a continuous relationship ever since. And fortunately, through changes of management, we've maintained a very stable relationship, and I've got a stable relationship with all the artists that I represent. And some pictures are sold up there and some pictures are sold down here, but at the dialogue we have back and forth between us, it's a robust dialogue. Sometimes I say, well, what are you doing? And sometimes they say me, and say, go and do this. But it's an honest dialogue, and it's a straightforward one. And so they know what I'm doing, and I know what they're doing. And we're all working to the one end, which is supporting the artists in a community with the only business that exists in the community, that has operated in the community, that is running at a profit in the community, and the only business that is owned by the community members and provides, in Papunya, for example, the Papunya Tula artists and their supporters have built the public swimming pool, a public pool, a dialysis centre, an aged care facility. I mean, that's the role that a small business, well-run in a community can perform. And why people can't see that supporting that industry is worthy when we support aluminium smelters and Holden plants and things like that. Why don't those community centres deserve support?
And I think also in terms of closure of Indigenous communities, it wasn't on the basis of them being unviable. No. So it was purely on the basis of a land grab. I wholeheartedly believe that. Yeah. There are resources on this land, and they want to move Aboriginal people off of it so they can get to those resources. So art centres provide this wonderful economic as well as social as well as political hub for the community. And to close those facilities down on the basis of them being unviable is just, it's a joke. So I think if we have those communities closed, then we will see the art change, and that's because there won't be wonderful art centres operating, supporting, encouraging, fostering that next generation of artists and mediating with that broader sector, which is that secondary sector further down in the East Coast. So we collectively have a responsibility to stop that from happening, stop the closure of Indigenous communities, and also stop the changes to the Aboriginal Heritage Act, be it in WA or any other parts of Australia, because they will desecrate sites, they will rip up historical, ancient rock art sites, and they will destroy people's connections to country, and we'll see it reflected in not just the art, but in the heart and soul of our Indigenous peoples, which is again the identity of this country.
Adrian, you want to say something?
Just in answer to the question, sorry, when I started in Aboriginal art in the early 80s, I don't think there were more than about 10 art centres in the whole country. Today there's about 120 or something, plus adult education centres, women's centres or whatever, all being supported by government funding. So on the one hand, it's true that the government wants to close down some communities, which is devastating for the people in those communities. And people that want to, we've seen Yuendamu grow 3 times in size as they've cut down, as the government intervention has closed down all those little communities around it that had lovely little schools and little shops and everything where people felt more comfortable. Now they're all thrown in together inappropriately, and, you know, there's with all the problems that are attendant upon that. But the government is putting more money into Aboriginal art centres than it ever has in the past. I don't know, it's up over 25 million now and growing. And so, you know, but they're putting all this money into production. You know, people make art because they want to indulge in their creativity, because they're keeping their culture alive, because of all the things. Are you saying
this is a lifestyle choice?
No, I'm not saying it's a lifestyle choice at all.
That was the
No, I'm
politician-
certainly
that was the
not saying it's a
politician's
lifestyle choice, right? I mean, art is keeping culture alive, and we understand this.
And making money for people and communities.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, there are no other economic games in town. And yes, it is but, you know, Aboriginal people will probably list making money from art down 4th or 5th on the list of the benefits they get from engaging in art practice. But what is the government doing in the marketing area, in the marketing sector? You know, we're producing all this art and they just think that, oh, it'll look after itself. You know, the market will just absorb all this art. Given the tsunami of art that's coming back into the market that's been produced over the last 50 years, you know, there's going to be tens of thousands of paintings every year coming back into the market that's competing with the art that Lizzie and other people are making right now. What are we doing to promote our culture abroad? Where's the government spending the money? What's the government doing about, you know, a superannuation, making it more and more difficult for people to buy art in their super funds, etc. Putting more and more restrictions on the market in terms of resale royalties and all. I mean, not everyone agrees with resale royalties. I have my particular point of view, but I'm not going to canvass it here. But the fact is that the government is doing nothing to promote Aboriginal culture abroad. Do you know, next year Brazil is the Foreign Affairs Department's country in focus because of the fact that the Olympic Games are on in Brazil, and yet Foreign Affairs has not initiated an Aboriginal exhibition in Brazil. It's just ludicrous.
Can I just come in at this point? I've just
Very briefly, because we've got 10 minutes
All right,
left.
briefly. Freshly come back from Istanbul Biennial. Djambawa Marawili was represented. The Bark Petition from 1963 was represented. Burnt Collection Crayon Drawings from 1947 was represented. Vernon Archie was represented. They were all there thanks to the contribution of the Australian government. I think we need to look at funding. I think the market is a consideration, but I think more importantly, Indigenous people, Indigenous artists need to benefit from this industry. There is no Aboriginal millionaires. There are no Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander collectors. There are no Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander auction houses. There is no Aboriginal, I think there's one, but we won't mention that person's name, who runs their own commercial gallery. There is many, which is fine. There is many non-Indigenous people in that secondary industry. That's fine. But I think the government needs to put money into Indigenous peoples and communities so that they can operate themselves in that secondary industry as well as being producers.
And can I just say quickly, because what you're saying, there's no millionaires, Aboriginal people, it's because sharing.
We got too much. Yeah.
We have to share everything.
But that's too, but
when people come, we give them food. They travel without blankets, bedding. We give them bedding. My brothers travel through via Tukula to go Kewerkura. They pull in they say, pay for my fuel, and I do it. I give them a note, take it to the store manager, and they fill the car up. Because we have to share everything. It's part of our chukurpa.
Yeah.
And sometimes I hate that, but there are times when we can use it to the max.
But it absolutely. And I mean, the sector generates hundreds of millions of dollars. Surely, at least one family, one community, one artist can at least say, I'm a millionaire. Out of this $500 million sector, surely one of us, even sharing everything that we have, surely one of us can operate in those terms and still share money with everyone.
My nieces, they're ringing me or Facebooking me, Auntie,
Send
put $100 for food. And I say, yes, but you got to give it back to me, boomerang. It's got to come back to me next week.
We have less than 10 minutes to go, and I'm just going to go to the final scenario very quickly. We've talked about Central Australian Aboriginal artists, but I wonder about Indigenous artists working in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. Do any of these issues affect them or their work? And how does this discussion relate to them? Do remote Indigenous artists get special treatment that their urban Indigenous peers do not?
My quote that I say is that the contemporary Indigenous art world and market was forged by people called Jungarai, Marawali, Naware, and it'll be owned by Jones, Cook, Boyd, for those who don't know, that the last three names I mentioned are three urban artists who are enjoying enormous fame and have great careers ahead of them. And the advantage that they have over their rural peers is that they basically grew up with a good understanding of English, and they went, on the whole, have had art school educations, and they are understanding of their culture, and they are making beautiful work, but they are not under the pressure that other rural artists are, because they have a backing of usually of families who some probably have $1 million or $500,000, but they have stable environments. They have alternative work choices. Their relatives and family have come from reasonably stable environments, and so that the community pressures that Indigenous artists in remote areas face usually don't apply to these guys. And so I see many of these people are good friends of mine, and I think that they will make unbelievable territory in the next few years, and they will be the Indigenous artists that forge the international careers of great standing. And
I think that's absolutely correct, and they've also supported each other through that process. I mean, so, you know, the establishment of Bumali and how Indigenous artists like Brenda Croft and Fiona Foley and Michael Riley, they were all about supporting each other and making a space and educating each other and informing each other about the market, the sector, and how to represent yourself. And of course, today we look to Proper Now and all of that impact that, you know, Richard Bell and Vernon are key. So it's everything that you said, Christopher, and it's also about city-based artists supporting each other. But then you go to a place like Darwin, and there is no art co-op. There are artists operating independently. They don't have, so it's not synonymous around all of our urban areas, but where it is on the East Coast, it works beautifully and really well, and we're seeing the results of that.
Jeff, you understand?
Francesca, would you say that there's any difference between an urban Indigenous artist and a non-Indigenous artist?
I wouldn't say there's any difference in terms of what drives them in terms of their art practice. Yeah. None whatsoever. It's about identity, connection to country, family, history, culture.
But the way their art is handled through the commercial gallery system is all the same, is it not? Yeah.
No.
It's not?
No.
Sorry.
No. the way the market engages.
Sorry, I think I think there's a bit of misunderstanding. You said, is there any difference between Indigenous urban artists and non-Indigenous urban artists? Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Yes.
Ah.
So not Indigenous urban and Indigenous non-urban.
If you take an artist like Richard Bell, and I
Yes.
visited his studio,
Yes.
and it's like visiting a non-Indigenous artist,
Yes.
and the way he markets his work
Yeah.
through the commercial galleries just seems similar.
Yeah. But you're seeing Richard Bell at this point in his career. Richard Bell, in that very beginning, wasn't even, like Marshall Bell, his brother, was operating at the top of that level. And Marshall was operating with the assistance of Laurie Nielsen and Michael Ether. And so there was a collective that allowed Richard to become that wonderful, gorgeous, crazy artist that
So
he
he had
is.
support.
So yeah, I've never seen an Indigenous person operate totally independently in the way that a non-Indigenous artist has. Not even Jonathan Jones.
No, but I just mean that they're positioned in the marketplace, fully savvy of how the gallery system works.
Yeah.
They have good relationships with their galleries and their curators, and they are in a financial position and in a support situation where they don't come under anything like the pressures that artists in remote communities come under.
So given our time problems, to sum up, what you're basically saying is that for Indigenous artists, it is an advantage, as it is for non-Indigenous, to be in urban areas, and for Indigenous artists, possibly as it would be for non-Indigenous, when you're in remote and rural areas, you have all the difficulties to overcome that everyone does in remote and rural areas.
And that's why good representation of artists. I represent white artists that live in the country, and I have no problem representing them.
Right.
And I represent, lots of Papunya Tula artists that live just near you, and I have no trouble representing them well most of the time. But the market from the Western Desert is a more disorderly market. There's more people dipping their finger into the pie. There's more people bringing work to the marketplace. There's more artists that do just like that. They're looking after their families. They are under family pressures. And if you ever look at a photograph of an artist holding up an artwork, look at their face. The ones that are in the compromised position are always like this. They never look happy. Look at Emily Naware. Never buy an Emily Naware picture where she's in the front of it like that. I just warn you, that's a little hint.
This is really good because it leads us directly to how we are going to finish.
Jane, just quickly.
Oh, go on, Lizzie, but you've got about 30 seconds.
I know. The thing is, everybody paints because they haven't got good English, they haven't got good education to do something else. When is the education department of this country going to train our young people to become doctors and lawyers and teachers and everything else? We have too many white people who are working in our communities. That's why they're all painting.
Thank you. All right, we're going to finish in 3 minutes. And each of you, I'm going to ask this one question. What is the best way to buy Indigenous art? What are the questions a buyer should ask? Christian, you first.
Okay, well, as the non-expert on Indigenous art, I think that the most important thing is for that question to become easier to answer, right? So the sophistication of the clues that some of the panelists have talked about looking to determine how you should judge art, the conditions under which it was created, what its value is, so on and so forth, suggests that it's really very difficult for the ordinary purchaser to become informed, right? It's not obvious what standard you're supposed to be. And I think that if there's anything initiatives like the Indigenous Art Code could do, it is making it easier for that question to be answerable to the ordinary consumer confronting this marketplace.
Thank you. Jeff?
I think it's a question of consumer education. Maybe even the problem is around Alice Springs, even a nicely designed poster put up in some of the hotels or on bus stations or something like that so that they can follow procedure that they should be looking at. But most of my work has been purchased through commercial galleries that I've developed an association
you
with,
have
and
a
I
trust.
trust them.
Yeah.
And I know that they have a connection with the remote communities, and I don't buy directly from the remote communities because I feel there's a safety in the commercial galleries that keep an eye out for work that they know that I'd be interested in.
Right.
So they're doing a lot of the work for me.
Yep.
Otherwise, I'd be spending the whole time collecting art.
Francesca.
I'd be doing what Christopher said, which was buy directly from the artist, as close as you can. So that's the artist, the art centre, that's at art fairs where art centres are selling directly to the public. You have so much to gain, not just a beautiful work of art. You'll establish a relationship with an Indigenous person that'll take you places that you never thought you'd ever find yourself at. So I'd go straight to the source myself.
Thank you.
All over the place. Sorry about that, Jeff.
Adrian.
I think it really depends on what you're looking to buy. You know, if you want you can go to an art centre, you can go to an art fair, but don't expect to buy the best painting that artist has produced during that year or whatever. Those paintings are reserved for the best galleries, the best exhibitions, through the representative model or whatever. There are independent artists that, and you know, I haven't had a chance to talk about it, but you know, I know an independent artist that has never worked for an art centre, that lives in Brisbane, that is putting 3 kids through private school, that doesn't care what his paintings sell for in the marketplace. He regularly comes to Sydney and sells a whole raft of paintings to those galleries along the quay and the rocks, and sells them a major painting for $1,500 each. And when I say to him, well, what does he sell them for? He says, I don't care. Every time I come to Sydney, they give me $30,000 and it pays for my school fees. And that's all I care about. So, you know, I think it's such a big question. And I think that buying from a good gallery, buying from somebody that has the expertise. If you're thinking, look, the Aboriginal arts industry has been going for over 50 years, and of course there was Aboriginal art long before that, but the modern Aboriginal art movement, in a sense, it's always been about the art of the new, the latest, the newest, the hottest. All through the history you can trace which community was hot then, where everybody wanted that work. There were lists of 50 people queuing up in an art centre to get a particular work. Now it's in the most recent times it was the Western Desert, and now it's urban art. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that's a lot to do with the fact that generation that walked out of the desert, fully initiated people, you know, before they'd met a white person, or grew up in the desert before they met a white person, they initiated this movement. I think to a certain extent, they were concerned that their culture was not going to be passed on, and they wanted to ensure that their culture was passed on to their children. And that golden period is over. There are still people living in communities doing great work, and there's a great future for Aboriginal art. I'm sure of it. But there is, as I said, hundreds of thousands of paintings have been produced over the last 50 years. If you're interested in the greatest artists of the movement, and I say, you know, even if you only think it's 90% of everything that's been produced, you have to buy it from somebody that knows about those artists' careers and can tell you what is a great painting and what is good provenance and what isn't.
Thank you, Adrian. Christopher.
Go to the best public galleries in the country, look at everything there, decide what you like. They usually got the best stuff. If you can, talk to the curators, get their recommendations where you should go and see. I would advise the closest thing you can get to the artist representative, but most importantly, to see their solo exhibitions, and there is the best chance you get to judge the range of their work, to see if they're any good, and then pick the best one you can afford.
Lizzie.
I'd say go to the Indigenous controlled and managed art centres and buy your painting there.
Thank you. Can I also thank you for the brevity of your answer? That was really wonderful. Very pleased. What a fascinating discussion. There was so much more on my notes that we were going to try to get to, but I had a feeling we wouldn't be able to get to it all because this is very rich and we've got a lot of panellists with a lot of really interesting things to say and quite a divide, which I really enjoyed hearing about. Before I ask you to thank the panel for their insights and their expertise this evening, can I just say a couple of things? There's a survey on your chairs. If you could fill that in, I know the organisers would be very grateful. And also, if you could please leave your phone number or email and name on that survey, because then you will be in the running for the Berkelow's Book Prize. So if you don't do that, you won't win the book. If you have any further discussions or questions about this topic, please go to the Leichhardt Council website where you'll find ongoing discussion around this. And then all that it remains for me to do is to say thank you so much, Christian, Francesca, Christopher, Lizzie, Adrian and Jeff. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. I've learnt an enormous amount. I'm sure many people in the audience have too. And could you join with me, please, in thanking all of them tonight? And thank you all for coming out on a Thursday evening, and thank you to Leichhardt Council and to the Indigenous Art Code for putting this together. It's fantastic, and it's raining just at the right time when we finished. Thank you.
So drive safely home, everyone. Thank you.